Hello, everyone. I'm impressed, even by myself, being here this early on a Saturday morning to conduct this conversation with Danny, whose work I know, and who I think I could say I know you quite well.
Yes, quite well. Yes.
I do want to say we didn't deliberately coordinate the colours that we're wearing today, but we arrived and his shirt matches my tights. There's nothing in it, I assure you. Did I say who I was? I'm Melissa Benn. I'm a writer and a campaigner, and Danny is the 1971 Oxford professor of geography at Oxford.
Yeah.
You've just changed chair titles, so I mugged up on your old title, and then you told me you've got a new title. So well done, Danny, for your new chair. You are also, I shall talk to you because you're on the stage, an author of many books about population growth, but mainly, in my experience, on inequality and the climate crisis, but inequality in particular threads through everything that you write about. And we're here to talk about this unusual book in lots of ways, which is 7 Children, Inequality in Britain's Next Generation. Unusual because it mixes an element of fiction and fact, and I'm going to ask you to describe it in a minute. I have, in my life, I'm of that age, thought about politics, thought about inequality for many, many decades, and I genuinely was shocked is an overused word, but shocked is the right word, at some of the figures that Danny reveals, and I'm going to mention one of them to you because it has stayed with me since I read the book, which is that 1 in 3 families in this country cannot afford to save £10 a month. And the other figure that shocked me is now a narrow majority, Danny can correct me, cannot afford to replace electrical appliances. And it's quite granular, the book, and I'm going to ask you now to describe why and how you did it. But I'm right in those figures, aren't I?
Yes,
Yeah.
You're right in those. This book is different to the other ones I've done. Mainly because I think I got to a point of saturation with writing non-fiction books about inequality and poverty. But also the situation became so bad that there wasn't any need anymore to produce an argument saying that the government of the day had got it wrong when they said things were getting better, they weren't. I can't remember. I mean, was it 2017 or 16? When was the last time the government ever claimed that things were getting better?
Oh, I can tell you quite recently.
Okay. Oh, they started again, have they?
I can tell you.
Okay. Oh, great achievements already. Yeah. But in general, it'll be interesting what questions you ask, but very few people would say that this country, England, is doing well in Europe. You know, you probably are aware that we are the most unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria, that our level of child poverty has risen after the cost of living crisis, that we have one of the worst levels in Europe and the fastest rising child poverty measured anywhere in Europe. And then there are a series of much more emotive facts or figures I could give you. They tend to get people depressed. I'm one of these weird people who looks at tables of numbers and actually gets sad.
Yeah.
And it's a strange kind of weird gift I've got, or I'm not very good at writing. I'm good at numbers, of actually seeing a table of numbers and thinking that's strange. To give you one example, I think it was 2001 census, and I'm very odd. I remember looking at the national report and looking at a cross-tabulated table which said who's living above the 5th floor, who's living in tower blocks, and then cross-tabulated it by age and ethnicity, and looking at a number and suddenly realising that the majority of the children who are living in the sky on floors 5, 6, 7 or above are black or brown and not white. And then trying to work out how did that happen. You're not supposed to have children that high up.
You do quite a lot of that in the book. You'll suddenly say, I didn't understand this number, or I went and checked this number out, and come up with interesting perceptions as you just have. But can you just do a basic thing of explaining to everyone what you've done with these 7 children and who they represent?
Okay. What I've done, because there are thousands of these different statistics about our lives, to try to make sense of it, I've decided to have just 7 children. They're going to be, or they are, completely typical children. So I began writing this book around 2018. There were 14 million children in the UK. I sorted them by the income of their families, child 1 to child number 14 million, split them into 7 groups of 2 million, and took the middle child of each. So these are 7 typical children of the UK, as much as you possibly can. There is a boring statistical reason about why it's 7 and not 5 or 4 or 8, but we don't have to do that.
Yeah.
You can read. But then, telling the story of each child from the point of view mainly of their parents. These children are born in the autumn of 2018. They're real to me. They are born on particular dates. I know what the newspaper headlines were when they're born. Their parents are constructed to fit the incomes, their tenures, whether they're renting or have a mortgage. That fits national income distribution. They even have the correct national distribution of siblings. I don't tell you where in the country they are, because I don't want to stereotype particular places. There are well-off and poor everywhere. To make things easy for me, they go girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, and their names are alphabetical. Anna, Brandon, Candy, Emily, Freddie, Gemma.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
You didn't notice?
No,
That's
no.
good. Well, there's much more of the story. I wrote a different book first. The different book was about a TV producer and an academic setting up a new version of 7-Up. So it was a book within a book. Impossible. Really, it's really hard to write that. But they created an app, and there were so many people applying to have their children as part of the new 7-Up that they needed a way to cut them down, and one was, well, let's just have them alphabetically like this. But also, I don't give them an obvious ethnicity or religion, because some of these things are too nuanced to explain with just 7 children. What I do is then go through a fictional kind of day or week or a few months in the life of their parents and what their parents talk about and what's happening to them, and quite a lot about bills, because the source of data for this book is what's called Households Below Average Income, which has been released since the 1990s, which is the statistics we use to produce the official rate of child poverty every March. And every March, the Secretary of State stands up and normally says they find something to say it's got better out of those. But the latest ones, which were released a few weeks ago, child poverty has risen everywhere in England.
Can I just make an observation from having read the book, that at one point you say that that statistic I mentioned at the beginning about the number of families that can't afford to save £10 a month, you said that got better at a certain point in your 5-year period, but it got better because those families were no longer paying for contents insurance in their house. And I think that's the kind of thing, and your word sadness is better than shock. I just kept feeling sad at reading those things.
It's definitely sad. As you go through these tables and looking for the thing that appears to have got better, a slight rise in people saying that they can afford to save £10 a month, no change in which parents can't spend anything on themselves. What had happened, and remember, it's numbers that do it for me, the fall in people who are taking out contents insurance exactly matched the rise in can save £10 a month. So what people are doing is taking risks. Now, the chance that you're going to need your contents insurance are always low. I probably could get through life without contents insurance. Of course, I've always had it. Fire, theft, flood. Right? And I bet most of you have actually had, so I'm stereotyping you by age, but you will have had an event where you claimed on your insurance when the washing machine went, and can you believe how much money it cost to replace the kitchen floor? I'm stereotyping you as not renting. The poorer you are, and 3 or 4 of these 7 children, really, most of us would think they're poor. The event that you would require contents insurance when it happens is devastating. You know, you've got no money. So when your possessions are stolen, or when they are damaged, or when there's smoke damage from the fire, you have nothing to go back on. And there are things still getting worse. Another one I'll give you is we have roughly, it's a third, approaching 40% of children have no summer holiday. You want to know whether you've had a holiday? Nice, easy definition. If in the last 12 months you spent a week outside of your home, not staying with family and friends, that's a holiday. Now that proportion has been fairly constant recently, but the proportion of parents who say we don't need one has been rising because there are increasing numbers of people in this country who cannot remember the summer holiday. And teachers now know not to ask children at the start of the school year, write about your holidays, right? Because this is a luxury. In the most unequal country in Europe, of course it's luxury. And we find it hard. I'm again stereotyping you. Well, you've paid to come to a talk in a literary festival, right? Already I've got a fairly good idea of your income and wealth brackets, right? Not all of you. Somebody might really, really want to be here. But
I don't think those two things connect. But anyway,
I know.
Moving on.
But if you take holidays, once you go above Gemma, and it's interesting, it's kind of giving away the book a bit, but once you go above Gemma, to the children I don't include, which are the best of million children in Britain, then you're talking, well, what will the summer holiday be? And maybe a little second one, skiing, Christmas, Easter, maybe not a week all at length, but certainly it's a lot of holidays when you actually think. And so in an unequal country, which is still a rich country, you have a few people taking many holidays and a huge number of people taking none whatsoever, whereas their grandparents would have had the week camping, the week in the boarding house, the week in the caravan. And to watch that division getting worse is shocking.
Yeah. Can I ask you something that occurred to me is that you take 7 children, each of them representing an income bracket across the piece. And so I didn't notice that Gemma was the last alphabetically, that's Sunday's child. I was expecting reading the book for the 7th most well off in this typical group to be having holidays, to be living a life of more, let's say, without stereotyping the audience, Cambridge, city centre Cambridge affluence. That is not the case.
No.
The last child, Sunday's child, they can't afford a holiday, partly because they work in a corner shop, which gives them a decent income. But also you do, and we'll come on to politics, you talk about the political preferences of the parents that you fictionalise, and it's the most well off in the book, who struck me as being not that well off, who is moving towards reform. And so can you just unpack that a bit?
The father's moving towards reform.
The father is, yeah.
Had fun with Gemma's dad. Well, he's annoyed. He's working really hard. It's a corner shop. The equivalent would be a couple of secondary school teachers, by the way. They're doing a good job at the corner shop. After tax, they've each got £25,000 a year income, so £50,000. If your household income after tax is over £50,000, you're not in this book because you're not typical. If you've got children, you're in the best of a million. One thing that shocks about the book is we've concentrated poverty amongst parents with children. So parents with children are poorer than most people. That's partly why it is so shocking. Running the corner shop, working hard, looking at the local school, not wanting that for his daughters, because he doesn't want his daughters to be running a corner shop. He'd like them to be lawyers or dentists or a profession. And then the issue is the local school. And if they don't have holidays, they might just be able to afford the nearby, not particularly good, but okay, private school. And then the chances in his mind of the daughter doing better is higher. The problem is he has 2, and not necessarily parents rich enough to help. A 7th is 14%. So the top 7th is 14% of all children. Gemma's in the middle. 7% are better off than Gemma. Gemma absolutely typifies that narrow slice of society who could just afford private school if they do nothing else and save and are really, really careful. And that's Gemma's dad's dilemma.
But he couldn't afford it for the second child, so
Yes.
they can't give one child something they don't give the other. And if I remember rightly, Gemma's mother works in the private school.
Yes.
That's right, isn't she? She's a poorly paid teaching assistant.
Mm.
So can I also talk about some of the knock-on developments or consequences of all of this, which is education is one, that what you see with a lot of the families you describe are parents terrified of the local school because they're terrified of the growing, I think immiseration is the right word, growing poverty in surroundings. So they become frightened of a local school because they think it's going to be full of people that they want to pull away from. That's correct, isn't it?
They'd often, I mean, this is expressed in about 2 or 3 of the families, would often like to live in a better area or are living in very cramped circumstances because they are in a better area. The children, towards the end of the book, go to primary school. So we have their first day at school. But everything, a huge amount, is about hopes for the children. You know, what can you do? And in the minds of these parents, one of the best things you could do is to ensure your child goes to a better school, is in a better catchment. So 3 of them were in private rented. We never meant private rented to be housing our children, by the way. When I was a child, almost all children have security of tenure in Britain. Right? You were either in a council house or you had a mortgage. There weren't children in private rented. Children, although they don't know it because their parents don't tell them, who can be evicted with too much notice. So there's a lot of fear amongst the parents and this hope of bettering, and how do you better? Now, Gemma's parents have the equivalent income of secondary school teachers. So we're living in a country in which the people who are teaching the majority of our children are better off than the majority of our children, but like most secondary school teachers, feel they're really badly off because we all live in these little bubbles. Secondary school teachers in Oxford, probably the case in Cambridge, they have to share houses like students used to do, which is partly why they're so young, because you can only share with strangers for so many years before it gets too much for you. So these constant consequences of an incredibly divided society that we have kind of got used to. This is just how it is. We're divided as we were back in the 1930s. We have issues of food poverty and people going hungry. Not quite as bad as the 30s, but certainly the worst we've had for 40 or 50 years. The majority of children who have a brother and a sister are going seriously hungry, I think 3 times a month. That's 56%. The statistic is thanks to Torsten Bell, MP for Swansea. And I keep wishing, and I shouldn't be mean, that the more that Torsten goes on Fridays to Swansea, because this is partly a book for people who look at statistics but don't feel the pain. We should not have children going hungry. And the children are going hungry after the parents, almost always the mother, has largely stopped eating. And that's what a cost of living crisis, I didn't expect as I was writing the book, for prices of food to rise in absolute terms 20 or 30%, and fuel. Now, if you are in the top 10%, this means what's just happened in Britain, it's one less holiday, okay? Or some other nice thing you might have done is no longer possible because your bills are higher. But what it means for the majority is an absolute drop in standard of living over basics.
So you're talking about people who look at the statistics don't feel the pain. I'm guessing that an audience like this is going to be feeling the pain, but also feeling a kind of, now maybe I'm imagining this, but as you talk, just as when I read the book, a sense of helplessness sort of bubbles up. And I think you're right that we have become used as a society to this division, although I think most people are not quite aware of how badly off most people are. I think that's the big message of your book. But can we come on to, we did promise we'd look at hope at the end. You said we must do hope, and I said, oh, really, must we? And I had actually already written hope, question mark. But can we talk about politics before hope?
Yeah.
So in the green room, we were talking, and you're younger than I am, but we're more or less of a generation that broadly, can I say, as you're an academic, you're on the left? Are you allowed to say that now in university? Anyway, I think you're on the left, and I'm definitely on the left. And our generation has failed. We have failed catastrophically in, well, first of all, to prevent any of this happening. Secondly, to create a political coalition that can do something about it. And I suppose, even though I spend my waking moments thinking, why is that? Because I'm that kind of a person. I want you to tell me why it is. Why have we failed?
I joined the Labour Party, I think it was 1983, age 15. And I left at age 18 when I walked into a Labour club in Newcastle and everybody put their pints down. I didn't even open my mouth, they could tell I was going to be annoying.
I don't think you are annoying, actually. I've met a lot more annoying people.
Think Rick Mail for the young ones. But my mum used to run Labour Party committee rooms in Risinghurst, and my granddad was in the Labour Party. That kind of middle-class Labour Party thing. So sort of your life's definitely my life. I've come to the conclusion that the line used to be that the Conservative Party were the most effective, streetwise, fighting political machine in the world, right? That was the way we dealt with this mentally, that we were up against such a good party, no wonder it was so hard. Now look at them, right? And we've seen them at their most obvious, and they never were. They never were. The boys and women in the 1980s were not the smartest cookies on the book. In hindsight, we on the left were the least effective left, I would say, in Europe, the most divided. And you can come up with reasons as to why. I come up with empire and our system. But really a liturgy of failure at various points, including particularly New Labour, which did do some good things, independence in Scotland, double glazing in council housing, funding the NHS was good, taking 1 million children from just below the poverty line and putting them just above so that none of them can actually tell, and your inequality statistic doesn't alter 1 iota is not an achievement.
But people think it was an achievement.
I'm still a member of the Labour Party, there are certainly people in the Labour Party still, what the great achievements that were done, particularly by Brown. And I'm being disloyal, but I've reviewed the latest book that Brown's an author of, Gordon Brown, with 2 financiers. And it's a book about understanding the world of kind of high finance. But it's how did we get to the point of having Tony Blair and Gordon Brown rather than people who could have been more affected?
Yeah. But so that's really my question, that there's one argument that New Labour was covertly redistributive. You've said they were marginally covertly redistributive. Then Corbynism was overtly redistributive.
Yes.
We can argue about 2017, highest popular vote, but failed to win. 2019 was a perfect moment, wasn't it? Corbynism, I think, catastrophically failed. In its place came a catastrophically failing Tory party. Why was that? I mean, I've got my own answers. Why did...
I'll get you to tell you. May 2019. So always start with the facts. That's one way. May 2019, Labour were 10 points ahead in the polls. So it wasn't necessarily that whatever had been set up by then was necessarily doomed to fail. It was a mess.
Yeah.
I mean, what was around Corbyn was a mess. It wasn't a well-organised machine. There was unbelievable hatred within that Labour Party. Diane Abbott is speaking later today. But it wasn't just Labour that did it to itself. I think a a subconscious decision was made amongst people whose children are in the top million that that manifesto was untenable. That you couldn't have this, and that leaving Europe was preferable. Given the two choices were essentially, we're going to have a 5-year plan, a change in the country, which the top 10% would see their share of income fall, to, if it had come off, would have taken us within 1/100 of a percentage point of Germany. We were going to become Germany in 5 years, an average European country. This would have enormous effects on the best off million people. Start with that school decision. All your hopes and dreams for your children go away if you're going to be taxed higher. You're going to lose out in all kinds of ways, and what you're being offered if you're well off is this fanciful idea that your grandchildren will have a nicer society to grow up in, but you're going to lose out in the short term. And I think that is why from June, July, August of 2019, the attacks became so strong on Jeremy. The cover was anti-Semitism. You can't trust him because he's an anti-Semite. Or for those who believe that our nuclear deterrent is some amazing thing that makes us safe, he's a terrorist and unpatriotic. But why was it so across the board? And including, and this really annoys my friends in The Guardian, but that newspaper is on record. You can look at what was written about Corbyn in The Guardian and where The Guardian was going. And once The Guardian is essentially telling its readers, you can really do what you like in terms of voting, you've lost it. The media played a big role. I remember talking to one nice old bloke in Oxford who told me he was never going to vote Labour in 2019. He'd always voted Labour in his life, but he wasn't going to vote Labour, not while that man was in charge. I asked him how he voted in 2017. He said Labour, of course. Corbyn had to be turned into a demon, and was turned into a demon.
But is this something in the English psyche, or the British psyche, but I think particularly the English? I mean, here, if I could just invoke my own inheritance as the daughter of what a man once called the most dangerous man in Britain, who then became a national treasure, Tony Benn, for anyone who doesn't know who he was. And then exactly the same, he was a very different figure to Jeremy, and in some ways, a kind of better public politician, if that's fair to say that. Is that fair to say that? I don't know.
Much more diplomatic.
Anyway, more strategic maybe. But it was the same story, decades apart. And it's made me think, and I really am going to get on to hope for everyone here who's feeling a bit like lowered by this discussion, that anybody who suggests something seriously redistributive is going to be monstered. Yeah,
because of fear at the top. And that's partly why you become and remain the most unequal country in Europe, because there's so much fear amongst those of us with the most power of what we're going to lose, that instead of thinking we have to change this, you think, what nice little things can we do for poorer people? Can I be on the board in the Catholic school trust because I care about them? Rather than thinking, what the hell are we doing having unelected people running our children's schools?
Can I just ask you about Europe? Because you say many times that we're the most unequal country in Europe. You also say we're the lowest taxed in Europe. But we are told politically that we are we're taxed beyond our,
We've got the highest tax rate for 70 years. So taxes generally rise and public spending rises over time as the population ages. So there's just more that's got to be done. And as basic demands rise, so we can't have any more Kathy comes home. You can't go round streets with a child in a pram not being housed anymore. There are basic things that we do that we didn't used to do. Yeah. So I can draw you an imaginary graph in my hand of our tax rate, and it goes kind of like this, and then big debt, 2008 banking crisis, down again, COVID, and it's now higher than it was at the start. And if you forget those highest, but above us, is every other country in Europe except for Ireland and Switzerland, and they've got strange economies, right? So that pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland, all those American firms in Ireland. So we are the lowest taxing and public spending country on the continent. And the ones at the top, I don't think cynicism is good. I sometimes try and do for school children a talk when I tell them about this terrible place called Belgium and this terrible place called Finland and this terrible place called France and how they tax so much more than us and how, you know, it's an economic desolation where people don't do well. We're living in a continent where there are huge differences in how societies are run, so we can see the experiment. Or my favourite one is Scotland. Scotland is the only part of the UK which had child poverty fall in a dozen areas, at least in March. Scotland has the lowest rate of child poverty in all of Britain. It is lower now than Surrey or the southeast of England. There are fewer poor children in Scotland. This is a decision of the Scottish Government, the SNP, made during the beginning of the cost of living crisis to make a payment to families with children, roughly 2 out of 7, which began at £10 a week for every child under 6, for every family claiming any kind of benefits, and is now probably about £26, £27 a week for every child under 16. It's £4,000 for a family of 3, untapered, you don't get everything's taken away. Means that no child in Scotland need go cold or hungry, and brilliantly, thankfully, the Scottish Labour Party ignored Gordon Brown, who didn't like it, and are supporting the SNP in a policy to actually eradicate child poverty in Scotland. So when you hope this is happening, the best example of what you can do in Europe is actually happening within the United Kingdom. We don't report it.
Yeah, well, I don't, because I didn't know that, and all I know about Scotland, and I do read a range of papers, is that their education system is so much worse, apparently, than ours, because they didn't follow Go-Vite reforms. I mean, there is a real problem about the way, the kind of information that we are being given as a society by, you know, I don't want to sound like a sort of conspiracy theorist, but by the BBC, by the mainstream newspapers. There is, isn't there?
It's subconscious. It is a subconscious conspiracy that the grown-ups in the room are running the country. If I put myself as an English politician now, say high up cabinet or shadow cabinet, we're the best people to do this. This is still a good and a great country. It's gone in a great way. Something sad has happened in Scotland. We gave them a little bit of freedom. They've gone and been stupid and elected the SNP. A country full of corruption and camper vans. Right? Most of what you'll hear is about a camper van.
Do you mean Nicola Sturgeon's camper van?
Nicola Sturgeon's camper van. Right. They still let their children go to university for free. Well, that can't be right, can it? Their children don't come down here anymore, by the way. There'll be literally almost no Scottish children at Cambridge. Why would you? Right? Scotland has actually left. Independence has happened culturally. It happens when the upper middle class no longer come to the universities down here. There will be no more goes. You know, he headed down.
Well, that's such a shame.
He headed down from his little private school in Scotland to Lady Margaret Hall, I think, in Oxford. There's a whole coterie of, you know, part of the union was, some of you come down, you can even be in cabinet, right? That's ended. It's a disbelief that it is possible, I'll put cynically, but almost there, it is a disbelief that it is possible for people who haven't done PPE to run things well.
I think that's so true.
And at the top of the Scottish government are a series of women, mostly in their 50s, very determined, really interesting to watch, rather like a lot of European politics, whose actual wish is for people's lives to get better. Not that they will get a job later in the finance industry where they're no longer a member of parliament. It's a different culture.
Yeah, but So, in the interest of balance, I think I've sat in this room with Rachel Reeves before she became the first female Chancellor. There's no question Rachel Reeves and most of the Labour front bench want most people's lives to get better. It's not a personal problem.
Yeah.
It's just they've entered government, and as we all know, everything is around growth. The only thing that can change the facts in your book is growth, and growth is eluding them. So that's another way of saying, how do you rate the Labour government after nearly a year in terms of the arguments that you make in this book?
I can remember saying after about 6 months, it could have been worse. I was sceptical. If you remember right at the beginning, they were having meetings with BlackRock and so on, and it looked really weird. And there's been a lot of meetings with the big house builders, and there's now a free-for-all, and nature doesn't matter so much. I was surprised about the two-child policy. I did think they would just do that. I didn't think they would. There's been 10 sets of fiscal rules, right? These are started by Gordon Brown. They're not rules written on stone. They don't make much sense. They make absolutely no sense once you started an international trade war. There's nowhere they're going to. But there's a lack of imagination about what is possible. And so 20 years ago in Southwark Cathedral, I did a talk with Rachel Reeves. And she's very much within the bubble. And the bubble that begins, I can do this because I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, right? Rachel turns up age 18 at St John's College to do PPE. That's the beginning of a particular education into a way of thinking and being, which is a grown-ups in the room thinking, where you understand what's possible, you understand the financial markets, you understand how much money that this government can borrow, you understand how tenuous it is, you try and do your best, and then there are these weird mavericks, strange academics like me, 30-odd people on the left wing of your own party who believe in some kind of utopia, and your job is to stop them, stop your father, and stop the Tories who clearly absolutely don't give a damn, many of them. Not all of them, but there are psychopaths amongst them. I think we can say that now. I think we can, we've had rising child deaths in Britain under the Conservatives. Now either they were so stupid they didn't understand that their policies were going to kill more children, or they didn't care.
Yeah. You do a short bit about Boris Johnson's Levelling Up programme, which I was always sceptical about, just because I was sceptical about Boris Johnson. But you say it was clear that they targeted it at areas where there were Conservative MPs. I don't know why nobody said this more often. And also areas where it was not the worst kind of poverty. It was...
Oh, it's bizarre. And the reason I knew about this, I'm lucky in my job. I was contacted by the Good Law Project, Jolly On or whatever, and they actually took the government to court over the Levelling Up. So I got to do a statement to court. It's a public document. It's about 50 pages long on the formula. And this most bizarre formula to work out, which included things like extreme rural isolation, so that if you are living in a nice cottage at the heart of a national park, you're more likely to get money. It was, how on earth can you take various indicators and skew them to move money towards your people? I mean, it was a work of art by some junior civil servant. Had really spent ages with a spreadsheet altering the statistics, until it could be done. But The Economist said this. I mean, you only had to look at where and it's a paltry amount of money also. But it was going to allow you, this was the money would allow you to stand in front of the new building you'd built in the middle of your town just in time before the 2024 election, supposedly. But it was peanuts, it was corrupt, it was just wrong.
No, you say it like it is. I like to hear that. Now, before we go to hope, because I want you to finish with what we can hope for and what we can all do, I'm quite interested in what you say about PPE and the bubble. And I just wonder, maybe it would be good to get rid of PPE and maybe to do something with Oxford and Cambridge, given that it keeps creating even Labour generations that then lack the courage or the ability to break out of the bubble to to do anything. You don't have to answer that because you're at Oxford, but that's my suggestion for the morning, because it's so true, and one sees it over and over.
The way I would do it, I'd say your children don't need to go to Oxford and Cambridge. If they really like libraries, we've got 100 libraries in Oxford, in the city, only 2 of which I could go to as a child, by the way. And still, we don't let the children of Oxford into these libraries. If your children really like libraries and reading books and don't like nightclubs and don't like hills, right, and do like dressing up occasionally in gowns and want a safe space, but don't see it as a great achievement. This country is so insular that these universities also produced Attlee and also produced Harold Wilson. The irony of the attacks is we had a leader of the opposition who didn't even go to university, went off and did voluntary, and he was labelled as a posh boy because he'd gone to a really crap private school in the middle of the countryside.
Is that Jeremy Corbyn?
Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah, but they told that against him as well.
They told that against him. We've got to get away from the mindset where people think that because they've done an undergraduate degree, they're an expert at the age of 21. Like, really? Matt Hancock's my favourite. Matt came here and did a master's in economics. So obviously he's an economic genius, right? It's just the beginning of your education at the degrees, right? It doesn't mean that at the age of 21, a PhD doesn't mean you're an expert. It means you've written a book that nobody should ever have to read, right? You're still a student. It's learning, right? The thing carries on. But somehow we have got this national culture of going, oh, they went there. They must be clever then.
And actually, without picking on Michael Gove, which I'd never want to do, his reforms in education in the state sector absolutely confirmed that it all became about A's, A stars, what university you go to, and that supposedly led to social mobility, which supposedly ended all the problems that have got worse over his period in office. But we've got to go to hope. Sorry, we have to go to hope. What hope do you offer? What do we do? What do we all do?
It's seeing the folly of the past, maybe in a kinder way than I can do. I mean, cynicism is but Gove's policies were to create little Goves. And Andrew Adonis, who there were Labour and Tory figures who had the same policies, that when the £9,000 fees came in, it went straight from Two Brains to Mandelson via Lord Brown. David Freud stayed in the government. Lord Freud worked for Labour and then the Tories. So we've had a single way of thinking. And we're back to that again with the current Labour Party.
So how do we create little Dorlings, not little Goves?
Little Dorlings are weird. It's this lost out generation. Because it stretches all the way up the fear, then there is a sense out there that things have gone badly wrong, and they didn't go badly wrong because of globalisation. If you can simply look at other countries where it's so much better, it's the same globalisation for them. So getting a younger generation to understand that things went badly wrong, also realising in the past that older people changed their views too. My favourite is William Beveridge, who changed dramatically what he believed about human beings in the 1920s through the 30s to the Beveridge Report of 1942. That's an old person changing his views. What we don't have is the carnage of the First World War and the Second World War, which helped galvanise people, because clearly your elites have failed when they've taken you to World War twice, right? You don't trust the older generation, and that's partly why we could do dramatic things in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Yeah. We don't have that, but nobody celebrates, thankfully, these past few governments. I wish the right wing of Labour would stop celebrating the Brown and Blair years, because that makes you think, oh, we can just go back to, I don't care how much the rich take as long as they pay their taxes, right? We have to see it all as a failure. It very simply is, statistically, when you compare it to other countries, and work out that we can't carry on like this. And we have to look to places like Scotland, which have actually shown us what you can do with a small tax rise on the well-off and very targeted, because it's only the children they can help, not the elderly, but very targeted, but it's about the far future.
Yeah. I like that. I like that your recipe for hope is to recognise that the last few governments we've had were total failures. That fits completely with my mindset. I think the other thing to say about your book, I'm going to open it to questions, is that it's also about looking at other human beings in a different way, stopping seeing it about personal failure, stopping believing in meritocracy, stopping believing in social mobility, and believing that others are doing their best and are fearful and are living in very difficult conditions, and understanding that and not being afraid of others. But I have to open it to questions. Sorry, because stop being interesting, because I've got to get people to ask you questions. Right, right. You, go.
I mean, just to follow on what you said there, how do we...
Sorry, microphone.
I'm normally quite loud anyway. How do we get people to read? How do we convince? I mean, my brother, who's a property developer, he blows my. I upset him. I want to pay more tax.
Yeah.
Sorry, you won't do that.
Yeah.
How do we convince people it's okay, right? Especially if in the top 10, 5%, are you really going to miss 50, 100 quid a month? Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Maybe it's about putting it in that more concrete terms.
There's a fear of the slippery slope. Once you begin to do that for people at the top, there's a fear of where it might get to. And remember, you don't get high up in the top unless you're quite interested in money, right? You're not going to end up with a lot unless you're quite... You start with saying that the only fair form of redistribution is government. You might be philanthropic and think, I'm going to give my money to this charity or that and so on. It's really inefficient. It doesn't help. Government does it fairly, particularly if it has a good tax system that can spot cheats. And there are lots of good examples in Europe of how to do that. Because when you say get 40 or 50 pounds less a month, the people doing better than you get slightly more taken off them. There's nothing you're going to lose out on. You, sir, will still be able to go to a Taylor Swift concert should you wish, because the tickets are going to have to come down in price to who can afford to do them. There's a lovely economist in the States, Robert Frank, who co-authored the main textbook with Benn, who tried to explain how higher taxes for the rich don't make anybody worse off, because they simply, the cost of yachting, of moorings in marinas will have to go down, right? So it's trying to explain that, also understanding that the reason we end up in this situation is because we see taxation as theft. We've been taught to see only stupid people pay their taxes. We have a ridiculous self-reported tax system for income, which is basically inviting people not to declare things for tax. The rich are very scared of breaking the law. It's interesting that they are. But the other thing you say is that this is a necessity. It has to happen. And once you bring it in on the point of principle, for instance, the wealth tax, once you bring it on a point of principle and a necessity, you get used to it after a couple of years, and then you can tweak it. But there aren't many successful examples of doing this. But there are countries in Europe where people say they're in favour of paying tax. Finland's a famous one. But there are 5 countries in Europe which are more equitable than the 5 Nordic countries now. And Germany and France are almost as equitable. It's a different way of thinking. But there are other big differences. If all your children are going to school supported by the state, then of course you care about state funding for education. Whereas we have divided our society. Just walking through Cambridge this morning, here are all the schools for the people who don't want to use the state, and the hospitals and the clinics for people who don't want to use the state. And we've created a kind of class apartheid.
Yeah, and that's got worse. Lady there, and then I will take lady right at the back. And then you, the gentleman in the blue sweater.
I'm afraid I haven't read your book. Sorry about that. I've got a couple of questions. One of them quite nitty-gritty. For example, when you talk about saving £10 a month or not, is that putting money aside so I can pay my bill when it comes in? Or putting money into savings for long term? This is a big difference. The other thing, I retired, but I worked directly with children and did research face-to-face with children. And I'm wondering, when you put together your 7 case studies or examples, whether you ever look at qualitative research rather than purely working with statistics. Because, for example, when you talk to children or young people about what has made a difference in their lives, or what has given them a sense of, I can get out of this situation, I can do something different. It's often about people or experience.
Yeah. Can I stop you only because we're running out of time? Can you answer those 2 questions briefly, and you can come up to him afterwards, and he can tell you the longer answer.
So the £10 a month is after having paid bills. It's not saving for paying the next bill. It's £10 additional for paying the bills. This book was turned down by many publishers because you're not allowed to write a non-fiction fiction mixed book. But 3 of the publishers asked me, and this is gratifying, did I have the permission of the children's families to write about them? So I did try to make them as real. I got lots of nice people read early copies for me. There is a lot of anecdote in there. So, for instance, a child who's on free school meals but can never actually get the right combination of food to qualify is a real child that a friend of mine knows. So almost all of the slightly more gritty examples are from not qualitative research, because I'm not a qualitative researcher and I didn't, I would have to have gone through a whole ethics procedure. I didn't talk to any children for purposes of, but I have children. I was a play worker. You know, my first only ever job, proper job, was working with children. But it's quite a lot of the things that are slightly more complicated are real stories that I've been told by people I trust.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to take the 2 people I said could ask questions, but can I take you together? And can you ask, like, one after the other? And can you ask your questions quite briefly? And can you answer briefly? Sorry, yeah.
Just start with a brief comment. Having read the book, I believe we should have free school meals for all children. So that's just a marker. You didn't say much, Danny, about housing costs. They feature quite a lot in the book, but we didn't discuss them. And how do we bring up a generation of children who can do better in the democratic process than we have done?
Great. Okay, and the lady at the back. Yeah.
My question is your thoughts on the current attack on disability.
Welfare. Do you mean welfare cuts? Yes. Good, because I meant to ask about that. So much to ask about. Can you answer both of those quite
really
succinctly?
Quickly? Yeah. The second one mother in the book is disabled but doesn't claim because it's just simply too complicated. It's not about, the book was finished before the current attacks. The current attacks are bizarre. I mean, we're in this bizarre growth thing, which I can't do it quick. I'll do it quickly. It began with the Chancellor, George Osborne, in 2015, claiming that if we followed his economic plan, we would be the richest large country per capita in the world. And Starmer's repeated, with a slightly different claim, this absolutely stupid Make Britain Great Again kind of thing. Why on earth we don't? We are beginning to roll out free school meals more, but there are countries in Europe which have had them since 1945, and they're just called school meals. Housing, housing is key. And what we should be doing, at least as like, remember Labour numerously promised to alter tenancy agreements. We should make it impossible for a family that pay their rent to be evicted, so that children cannot be evicted, don't have to lose all their friends, change schools. And you can start with the children. Nobody in their right mind blames children for the circumstances that they're in. So we can start housing reform. And lastly, you can look at what they're doing about landlords in Scotland, right? Because we've got a part of the UK that is beginning to do this itself. We shouldn't have a third of our children living in completely insecure tenure with the poorest parents, with the highest housing costs of all families, because the rent is higher, and that helping being the pension for somebody else, or allowing, and there's a very strong landlord lobby. Only 2 or 3% of people are landlords, right? But the screaming and crying you hear from landlords about how much they have to be a landlord, right? No, you would let nobody set up a school unqualified or build your own hospital unqualified. But the idea that 2 or 3% of the population in this country are allowed to be in charge of the homes of other people, it is simply wrong. When we expanded the private sector, it was supposed to be students and young professionals, right, who have to move around a lot. Right? You don't want children moving around a lot.
Look, there are so many things in this book, and we haven't touched on all of them, but one thing I do want to say is you make quite an argument against means-tested benefits, talking about your own childhood and your mother collecting child benefit and it being something that everybody did. And I think we're moving towards a means-tested mindset, which is the opposite of what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Don't you agree? Okay, I just wanted to mention that because it was important. I think we have to stop now. I'm sorry to everyone who wanted to ask a question, but thank you, Danny. Thank you for your work. And I hope that this group will go away and help campaign for all the things that you have said, and also create a new generation that do better than we've done. You've done quite well, but anyway, thank you, Danny.